Welcome back to the Comic Watchers show. I'm Matt, he's Chad, and this is our show.
And I'm on time.
And we're on time. That's right.
And live.
And we're live. So this week we have got author Jeff McComsey with us. Jeff, how the heck are you?
Thank you. Very well. How are you guys?
We're awesome. Thank you. Jeff has written a lot of cool stuff out there. My personal fave from his oeuvre is called Grindle, Kentucky. It was published as one of the initial AWA books a couple years back, and he is back for more with that publisher with Little Black Book. But first, before we get into that, Jeff, can you tell us a little bit about yourself as a writer, for just as a fan,
Sure.
for anyone that may not be familiar with you?
So I've been writing comics for a while. I started out doing a lot of self-publishing stuff, maybe, 10 or 15 years ago. I also illustrate comics as well. So I would write stuff and I would draw stuff. Sometimes I would write stuff for other people. Sometimes I would draw stuff for other people. Sometimes I would write and draw stuff for myself. I would say, in terms of working with like AWA is something I've probably done in the past. I think it's been 5 or 6 years. I just had hit it off with Axel and Mike, the editors there, and I always felt like we sort of understood each other. So I've always had an open door to pitch stuff there. So that's been a big part of sort of my writing career for the past 5 years. And then in addition to that, like I said, I also draw stuff. And so like I just finished a series for Mad Cave Studios called Project Reese, which was a lot of fun, sort of a wacky post-war kind of Indiana Jones, evil scientist type story. So I was drawing a lot of crazy stuff. It was a lot of fun. And then, like I said, I also do just sort of self-published stuff that I kind of come up with to keep busy. And I also teach at Pennsylvania College of Art and Design, which is where I'm at right now at this very moment.
So. Awesome.
So, do you remember maybe the first comic that you read, or maybe the one that kind of
the very first
made you want to check out more?
I would say, my earliest memories, there was a place in the town that I grew up called the Newsstand, and they had comics on the old spinner rack. And I think the first books that I picked up were either G.I. Joe books or like early The Punisher stuff. And this would have been like right around when they went from like 75 cents to $1, like sort of that vignette. I guess that would be like the very, very late 80s or very, very early 90s, I guess.
Awesome. Okay. Awesome. So, Little Black Book, 2 issues are out. Number 2 shipped just this week. What can you tell us about this book?
Yeah, so I think the original inspiration for me for Little Black Book was sort of thinking about, as a father and thinking about sort of the legacies that we leave our sons. There's things that we essentially give to our sons or that they inherit from us. And there are things that they inherit whether they like them or not. So the original idea sort of behind Little Black Book was like, what if this wasn't like a genetic trait or something that a son had inherited from his father, but what if it was like an actual object? And the main character in the book is a character named Cole, and the story's essentially about him and his young wife who's pregnant. They're just starting out life. They live in sort of a cramped trailer, and Cole finds out that his estranged father that he hasn't heard from in 20 years has died, and just so happens to have left him a giant house. So of course he has a lot of feelings about this because he hasn't talked to him in 20 years. But he takes one look at his wife and she's like, look, we're going to take this house. They move into this house, and over the course of moving in, they discover some things that Cole's father had left behind there, and he sort of ends up inheriting them. So the literal inheritance of the Little Black Book is the Little Black Book. It's essentially a little book that Cole finds sort of in the rafters of the house. That it's a Little Black Book, and he's flipping through, and he's able to figure out that this isn't just a bunch of addresses and names. These are names of like hired killers and people to clean up after them. Crooked lawyers, crooked doctors. So it's essentially I always call it like a sort of a one-man crime book that he finds. And Cole's a very straight arrow. Like, he's not criminally inclined. He knew that his father was sort of a dirtbag, and that's why he sort of had nothing to do with him for so long. But he's found it. Now he has this sort of big book of crime that he's inherited, and he doesn't know what to do with it. Their first instinct, which is probably the right one, is to destroy it. But unfortunately, they don't do that. They get into some shenanigans shortly thereafter.
And there our troubles began. So, I've read the first issue, and unfortunately, I ran out of time to get to issue number 2. But I love the setup. I love the tone. Now, talking about things like theme and tone, like, you kind of tend to play in a lot of different genres across your career. What is it that makes you feel comfortable doing that?
Yeah. Well, I think the thing that's sort of like, even though, like Grendel, Kentucky, which you mentioned earlier, is a little bit sort of a bigger scale story. I still think they all sort of percolate around the concept of what I like to call like a small town crime. So the idea that like, there's these heroes and villains in all these little towns around us, essentially, sometimes these stories don't have to have massive stakes where like, the fate of the world is sort of hanging in the balance and things like that. So I like to find these sort of little stories, these little crime narratives, where these characters that, you might drive past or walk down the street next to can be these massive villains in their own little worlds that we know nothing about. So I like the idea as opposed to like, these, a lot of times crime stories generally tend to work around big cities and things like that, which we can always imagine there's a bunch of villains and stuff that lurk everywhere in the city. That's not the craziest idea we've ever heard of, but I like to sort of take that and apply it to like the small town America. Like, where are these little places and who are these guys that are sort of tucked away that we're discovering here? Maybe for me, it's also like, those are the kind of stories that kind of get me interested in an idea. And for what it's worth, I feel like when typing up characterization or dialogue, those characters kind of like, I don't know, talk to me easier, I guess, than something that might be like, like a big sort of like, intergalactic superhero story or something. Though I haven't tried one yet, I'm open for it. But by and large, I mostly like to do sort of your gritty small town crime stories. And I think Grendel, Kentucky, and then another one that I had done for AWA, which was The Fourth Man, which is sort of very much similar in this kind of small town crime thing. And Little Black Book is definitely sort of another chapter in that book.
So, I mean, in a way, you're following in a lot of the thematic footsteps of, say, like Ed Brubaker.
Mm-hmm.
Who are some authors that have inspired you a little bit to take that pathway?
Definitely, like, I mean, Ed Brubaker's a huge one right there. He does great crime stuff. I love that he just has this sort of niche carved out. He's done a bunch of other stuff, obviously, too, but like, I love his sort of smaller town crime stuff. He's a big inspiration. Let's see who else would be. Also, too, just somebody that I've always liked in terms of like characterizations and, more towards like when he does. I mean, he has this, Garth Ennis was the person I was going to mention. He obviously does a ton of different kinds of stuff, and some of it's totally insane. But I like the stuff, and again, like Punisher Max. And that was also another reason why working with AWA and working with Axel has been awesome. A lot of stuff inspires me in terms of like, movies and films and books and things like that. But when it comes to comics, a big influence on me is a lot of books that Axel was editor on. And now sort of having worked with him on some project, I can definitely see where his influence was sort of permeating through those pages a little bit. And I realized it wasn't an accident that I was always a pretty big fan of stuff that he was kind of involved in one way or the other.
Can you tell us a little bit about your the artist who's working on the book with you?
Yes, Philippe Cunha. He is a great artist. I had worked with Philippe before. I had mentioned that I had self-published stuff a long time ago. One of those was a zombie anthology called Fubar. So it had a bunch of different. So it was a bunch of different shorts, bunch of artists, bunch of different writers, and Philippe had been one that I had worked with all the way back then. I had liked his work then. And I think right about the time that we were starting to, I was starting to kind of think about Little Black Book and starting to get it down on paper. So it was like, hey, who do you want to work with on this? I think Philippe had just done, I forget what the exact title is, but it's a Romeo and Juliet update that he had done for AWA. So I had seen his stuff recently. It was very fresh in my mind. And he was available. So we were able to sort of get together on this. But he's been great. He knocked it out of the park on these. One of the big things, just as a fellow artist, that I'm sort of always looking for. And it's easier said than done. And it's one of those things like outside of the arts, you might not even think twice about it, but it's called keeping characters on model, essentially. So when you draw a character in this page and you draw a character on 5 pages later, we can still tell it's the same character. Now, obviously, this sounds like the most basic part of comics, but it is really difficult, especially when you're illustrating characters, when their heads filling up a panel versus then their heads this big on a panel. Like, how do we keep those things consistent? The most important thing, in my opinion, is clarity. The last thing you want, the thing that kills sort of at least my interest when I'm reading stuff, is when I have to stop and figure out, like, wait a second, where are these people at? And, who's talking to who here? Like, and again, like Philippe is all over that, just knocked that stuff out of the park. And also, too, Little Black Book, we haven't quite gotten there. We just started to get there in issue 1, but a lot of the story takes place in, I guess it would be Western Arizona, which has a very distinctive look. And I think Philippe just knocked it out of the park with that, with a lot of these exteriors that we have. And a great portion of the sort of second half of the book takes place almost exclusively kind of out in the wild. So he just nailed all that kind of stuff, too. So it was exciting to sort of get to work with Philippe on a sort of big scale project finally.
No, I don't want to spoil it for Matt, but since he hasn't read the second book, but um, in the second book, he kind of introduced a antagonist that apparently wants the little black book.
Right.
So, I mean, was there is there a character that you've grown attached to as you've written them?
There actually is, and this one's tough because the Little Black Book does have some spoilers in it. Like from the second issue, there's some pretty major things that are kind of revealed that change things up a little bit. But one of the things that you talked about, sort of what was the original inspiration for this, and I had mentioned father and the son. What we realize a little into the book is that this sort of criminal father had sort of raised some surrogate sons in his other life. Guys that were essentially bad guys, sort of just like him, and they feel a certain ownership of this book themselves, obviously. So what happens is, eventually sort of Cole's father's surrogate son sort of comes into his life and is looking for this book. And I would say he's definitely one of those characters that was a lot of fun to write. There's also just sort of, I don't know if you call him a goon, but part of this other brother's sort of entourage is an accountant named Cupcake. Who's like, essentially this other entourage. These are all like guys that I imagine were like on the football team in high school and college. Like they're just big jock dudes, and Cupcake is just sort of your run of the mill kind of mousy accountant character who's sort of in power because he's running around with these tough guys now. And of course, never ends well, but he's definitely a personal favorite.
So since you're playing in a genre with so much, so much well-worn paths that have gone over it, from, like we talked about, Ed Brubaker, you could also very easily throw out the Coen brothers.
Huge influence on that too, as far as just story and films go. Absolutely.
Yeah. What do you do to help give this story your own voice so that it stands out and doesn't feel like same old, same old?
And this is one of the things where like Axel Alonso and Michael Coase, sort of the two editors that I work with at AWA, are really great. A lot of that I feel like what feels like mine and when that sort of gets injected to me is sort of very early on in that outline stage. This is sort of just the way we work. I'm not sure how they might work with other writers, but I'll submit a pitch, it gets greenlit, then my next step then is to turn that into a really bulky outline where every issue is broken down, every scene in that issue is broken down, and just by wearing that down and sort of plotting that stuff out, it's just fascinating to me the way like the psychology of these characters just kind of manifests itself. And I hate to use the word, but it starts to feel unique a little bit, right? Like these start to feel like actual people that have opinions, and sort of like, the decisions that they're making don't feel like some writer behind the scenes is like, hey, this is what I want to happen, but rather what this character would naturally want to do. And I think that early on too, and this is one of the reasons why I just sort of like, trust Mike and Axel when it comes to these things, is especially, they've seen so many different stories and so many different ways into different stories where I feel like they would immediately bump with something if it felt sort of cliche. And there's certainly times early on where like, we might nix an idea because like, or at least an angle to the story because it feels too much like this or that, or it doesn't quite feel like itself. And I just love the fact that there's this organic sort of process that happens where these things eventually sort of click into place and it feels right. And then after that, writing the dialogue is just probably, for me at least, probably one of the easier parts. Once I have everything sort of plotted out in terms of like, all right, there's 7 scenes in this issue, I know what each scene has to accomplish. And then the trick just becomes like, how do I accomplish that without it feeling heavy-handed, essentially. A lot of it's sort of dropping exposition and dialogue. There's obviously very clunky and heavy-handed ways to do that. There are very sort of like more subtle ways to do that. And one of the things I like about this one, actually, all the series that I've done for AWA have been 4-issue miniseries for different reasons, but they've all sort of ended up right there anyway. And what I like about that is it's just 4 issues. It's just enough to tell a great story without sort of getting segued by something else. So a lot of that sort of comes down to like, is this sort of pushing this plot forward? If it's not, then we might want to reconsider it. If it is, good, let's do it. But a lot of it just comes down to reading, watching a lot of stuff, and just sort of using your instinct to say, okay, I'm not sort of the part of this that makes this original. Like, what is it? How's it mine? How's this unlike other stuff? And one of my favorite parts is that we don't really set out to like, oh, we got to tell a story that's a little different from everybody else's. But that's sort of what you're aiming for when you get down to it.
Well, there's the cliche that there's no new stories under the sun,
Right.
and that's true to a degree, but there's plenty of new voices under the sun.
Absolutely.
And
You know what it is? Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Mindset you have to adapt.
Absolutely. And I also feel like too, just as artists and creators, like we're essentially a collection of our influences. And the trick there, at least for me that I try to aim for is to sort of absorb a bunch of different things, right? Just so it doesn't feel like, oh, I'm just sort of regurgitating the one thing that I'm really into. So a lot of different movies, a lot of different books, read a lot of different comics, and they all just sort of coalesce as some kind of soup in my brain. And I guess, at least so far, it's been pretty easy to keep these things feeling original. And, the other thing too is you want an element of familiarity for the viewer, right? They should have sort of some idea of what they're getting into.
Sure.
You obviously don't want them sort of picking out entire plot lines, whole cloth, just from like the first issue or whatever. But if it feels a little familiar, that's okay to an extent, I think.
Right on, Chad.
So again, not to spoil anything, but we get a little more about Cole's relationship with his dad.
Mm-hmm.
Are we going to see, without spoiling anything for in the last two issues, are we going to see a little more about his dad's past?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of it too for this particular story, it came down to sort of figuring out what the beats, the beats are for the story, but also sort of, there's an element of what I want to tell of what's happened in the past. So it also becomes about sort of peppering in, not too much, but giving enough idea just through flashbacks and things like that. So via flashbacks, we definitely see sort of Cole and the few instances that they have where they interacted. We also see a little bit of what his dad was like back in his heyday, just to kind of give us an idea of the type of person that he was, where Cole came from. In the story, we find out that Cole had met his father, like they had lived together briefly when he was young, and his father's criminal life just sort of bled into his family life. And his father made the, sort of the decision that like, hey, Cole is better off without me. My family's better off without me. I better just skedaddle, which he does.
I thought the wife did.
Right. Well, essentially, he agreed with her, I guess. But yeah, his wife, in no uncertain terms, tells him he needs to get out of the house. So essentially, all Cole has is the idea, or just sort of the memory of this guy who pissed his mom off, and that was the last time he saw him. All he knows that his mom has told him as he's grown up is that your dad was a scumbag, and you're essentially, better off without him. And at the end of the issue, we sort of find out why that was the case.
A lot of fire in the second issue.
Yes, you know what, and I don't want to talk about. I don't want to spoil it, but what keeps happening to people in that issue is something that I was like, why did I keep writing this? Like, why do these people end up in this place? Because it's something that like I just mentioned it, and I don't know what it is. People end up in trunks in my story. I don't know what that is. It's never happened to me, but I would imagine it is horrifying.
You didn't do any research,
No. You know what? I feel like my only resource is like, can you get out of a trunk? You can, but it takes a little while. And if you're panicking, probably not.
I want to, you talked about Philippe's art, but I mean, especially with the kind of the Midwestern, the color is awesome.
Oh yeah. Marco Lesko was the colorist on this, and again, just like Philippe's stuff, like he took those pages of like outside Western Arizona. They're just gorgeous, and in my opinion, they just get better and better as the issue goes on. And when it comes to coloring, I've done a little bit of it. I primarily do line art for my own stuff. I do grayscales and some coloring. But one of the things you learn when you do digital coloring is that what you see on your screen is one thing, and what you get when the book prints could be another one. And what makes a professional colorist a professional colorist is knowing what will play on the screen and how that will play once you get it in print. And usually they're good at keeping it like it's like what I see on the screen is what I got in my book. So that takes a lot of skill. And having seen issue 1 and 2, I got my comps just recently for number 2. He's continuing to knock it out of the park. So yeah, Marco's been kicking ass on this one.
And did you how was the collaboration process with you as the writer, kind of communicating with the rest of the team as to the idea you wanted to?
I mean, I think we had a good working relationship as far as that goes. I know, sort of drawing comics impacts how I write comics. It's definitely sort of in my mind as I'm putting these things down to make sure that like I know what's asking too much of an artist. And it's never like, oh, that thing is hard for them to draw, I shouldn't put that in there. It's more like, how much am I trying to ask them to convey on this one page? And do I need to pump the brakes on what's going on there to allow like a moment to happen? Like for instance, comics are weird where the more panels you add, the more the more elongated the time is. So essentially, the longer it takes to read it, the longer those moments feel. So if you want something to be fast and have a little bit of gravitas, you need to dial back the panel count and allow those sort of panels to have big moments and things like that. So, I feel like I was always thinking about the art there, and I'd like to think that made it sort of, artist friendly for Philippe. I know on the rare occasions where like we have notes and stuff from the artwork, a lot of it for me is just sort of very, very small stuff. I'm not one to like look at a page and say, hey, let's try something completely different. Like I have a infinite amount of respect for how much time it takes to generate a page of comic art. So if I have any notes, I make sure that they're sort of, and again, on the few occasions that I did, that they're very deliverable. It's not something where I'm like, I've just doubled Philippe's workload for the week. You know what I mean? Like sort of very conscious of that kind of stuff. And to his credit, there's very few notes that we passed around on those. And again, they were just like a bunch of, sort of small edits. Like, hey, can we make those pants a different style or something like that? Relatively easy stuff. And, Philippe said it was a positive experience. I believe him. But like I said, it's always forefront in my mind to make sure that I'm not sort of being a pest to an artist. Just being picky, like, oh, let's try something else. Like he's like, he's just conjuring these things out of thin air or something. Just being very respectful of the fact that it's a tough job and it takes a long time to, even to get one page done.
Since you're an artist,
go ahead.
I was going to say, since you're an artist yourself, and do you feel like that affects how you approach your writing? Because I can always tell when I'm reading, like when I'm reading a writer and artist, because much more visual flair. Jeff Lemire comes immediately to mind.
Right.
That can't.
Go ahead.
And I just wonder, I mean, do you feel that one informs the other for you?
Absolutely, too. And I feel like, too, that one of the things that I see, at least that I know, like as a writer who also does art, a thing that doesn't worry me is occasionally dialing back the dialogue on the page to zero. Like allowing those, knowing that there are scenes that are going to function much better if I don't clutter them up with like, dialogue or a character talking to himself or something like that. Knowing that this scene is strong enough visually to carry itself. And conversely, on the other hand, knowing that there are some scenes where you do have to do walls of text for stuff. You know what I mean? Like there is a time and place for that. But just making sure that, being sort of thoughtful about how I apply those. But that's a big one too. And I really, it's one that sounds really simple, but just being aware of panel count and what you're asking for within those panels. Because if you're asking for like a big, like, hey, we see an entire room with 30 people in it, then I'm also saying that, hey, we see the main character in the back of the room and you have to convey that he's sad. Like, that's almost impossible to get all those things into essentially one frame, right? Like that's two frames. You've established the party, then we see it, then we see a close up on our character and he's sad. So just sort of being aware of like, how the beats can come across visually and just making sure I'm sort of teeing him up with the right kind of panel description and the right kind of shot size, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Chad, you were starting to say something before I interrupted you.
So, I mean, you've been writing comics for a while. I just realized you contributed to the Broken Frontier anthology, which was one of the first Kickstarters I backed. How do you feel that you've grown as a writer, and because you do, some of your own art as an artist?
Well, I'll tell you what's completely different. Like when I'm writing something that I'm personally illustrating, it is a mess. Like in terms of behind the scenes, like it's just not very like I sort of have it all up here and that's fine. When I'm working on something for AWA, we're clearly like I'm turning in outlines, I'm turning in scripts for each issue. It's much more sort of regimented. And I find that personally, while I love to sort of write and illustrate my own stories, it's a lot of fun. I find that my writing is much sort of tighter when I'm working more with like a company like AWA, where like I'm answerable and we're sort of checking in every different step of the way. I think in its most basic form, it's just that even then I know that I'm writing for, albeit a very, very small audience initially. It's usually just 2 or 3 guys that have to read and sign off on it. It just makes me sort of kind of bring my A game, make sure I'm keeping my dialogue tight. Another small thing that's a big one from doing my own art, also lettering my own stuff, is having an eye for like superfluous dialogue and things that, like one of the things I love about writing and drawing myself and lettering myself is as I'm working, I'm like, that balloon's taking up too much space. I'll just write a smaller line there. So just sort of knowing that like every word I say in a script takes up a visual presence on a page. So the more said, the less we can show, in its basic form. So those are the two things that I think that I've sort of honed the most. When it comes to artwork, for me, this is silly, but when you're working on like a 6-issue miniseries, it is a ton of work. I mean, like it is a ton, and it's very easy to put your blinders on and stop checking in with like other comics and other sources of inspiration. So having just wrapped up that Mad Cave project, the first thing I did was go to the comic shop and buy a bunch of comics, old stuff, new stuff, and just sort of like re-immerse myself in there. So artistically, it's the challenge is remembering to experiment and go out and read new stuff and just take in new influences. It's very easy to kind of get your blinders on and just keep doing the same style that you've been doing. I mean, that's how you have to work when you're doing a 6-issue miniseries or any sort of series of length. Like you cannot change styles in the middle of it. That is a bad thing. So that's a challenge there, just keeping that sort of consistent all the way through. And then once it's done, just remembering that, like, hey, I want to go out and experiment and do some digital coloring stuff or whatever, and just kind of keeping that fresh and not getting burned out.
So you, sorry, I thought Chad had a follow up to that. I was gonna say we've actually got a comment here from Juan Matoa, who said he just read issue number 1 and that the Raising Arizona cover called his name. So.
Absolutely. So that's Chris Ferguson is the art director at AWA. This series had, I guess there's 3 covers for each issue, and Chris did one of them, and each one of them will be a Coen Brothers homage. So I think Raising Arizona was the first one. I think the next one is a Fargo one. I forget what 3 and 4 are. 4 is No Country for Old Men, but I can't remember what 3 is. But in addition to that, we had some other artists that did, artists that I follow, I'm a huge fan of, who did a bunch of cool covers. But yes, the Coen Brothers, just in terms of stuff that I like and read and write, it's always sort of in the microbial DNA. I think just in terms of small town crime stuff, I think of like Fargo and No Country for Old Men. Obviously 2 very different stories, but they both have this kind of small town dread crime thing to it that I love, that I'm always trying to hit with these stories.
So you seem to be having a, you're playing in your own sandbox right now. But if you had the opportunity, is there a certain character that you would like to put a certain spin on?
That's a tough one. The ones that I would love to do it, and just that I've seen the books that, what is it? Is it, I can't even remember the name of it. It's Kirkman's imprint that's doing the G.I. Joe comics.
Skybound.
Thank you. Skybound, any of the new G.I. Joe stuff, like I heard from a good source that years and years and years ago, probably in the late 80s, G.I. Joe comics and Transformer comics were pulling in I think like thousands and thousands of new readers a month, essentially. And I was talking to somebody who was sort of, involved in editorial publishing back then. And as he's telling me this, I realized that I was one of those readers. Like I was watching G.I. Joe cartoons and Transformer cartoons. And then I was like, hey, there's the comics on the rack. And those are the first books I bought. And that was it, essentially. So any of the Skybound stuff, the Transformer stuff, the G.I. Joe stuff, the miniseries that they're doing for different characters would be awesome, in my humble opinion.
Robert Kirkman, I hope you hear this.
Yes, please.
Yeah, man, Skybound is just killing it.
They really are. Like, and they're getting artists. I mean, obviously, it's all subjective, but they're getting artists that I love. Do the art and do the covers and writers that I like. So it's very exciting as far as I'm
very
concerned.
Cool. It's a good time to have been an '80s kid.
Absolutely.
What about at the big 2, man? Like, who would you love to sink your teeth into?
Well, I know he goes under a bunch of different iterations, and he's not quite the character that he was, but the Punisher is one I know is a sort of a controversial character and potentially very offensive. But I still feel like, I've read enough of the character and I have ideas, whether or not they would work out with editorial's ideas or not. Like the Punisher is one that I would love to do. As far as big 2 stuff goes, in addition to that, I don't know, like everybody, I would love to take a swing at some Batman. You know what I mean? I don't care how it is or what it is. In addition to that, one that I would never want to write, but I just like to read would be like X-Men stuff. Like I was a big X-Men fan too. Back in the day, and I'm sort of slowly crawling out. It's been years since I've sort of followed stuff. I'm starting to catch up on these things. But that's one, I don't know, that I just love, like as far as team books go, I feel like that one would be just a ton of fun to work on. Artistically, I think team books are like, I don't know, running in like a marathon or something. Like they're
Bit of a nightmare.
crazy hard. Like it takes there's like a certain few people that can handle it, and I'm glad they do. But yes, it's extremely hard. And the trick there is like, again, you've got 10 characters on a panel, and we want to see all of them. We want them all to be doing their things. It can be very, very, very difficult. So I've always had nothing but respect for people that do sort of big, crazy team books.
So working pretty well independently for the bulk of your career, do you kind of find that, in a sense, you're having to be on the hustle a lot, if that makes sense?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, yeah, no. So in my heart of hearts, I'm a freelancer. You know what I mean? Like that's sort of, I'm always kind of like the challenge there is like, while you're trying to do a good job on this thing, you also have to be lining up the next two things, which is its own thing. And it's certainly a hustle. Something that's been very helpful in my career is Kickstarter. I sort of started crowdfunding books, I don't know, maybe like a year or two after Kickstarter started. So I'm always like, left to my own devices. If, nobody's biting on my pitches or whatever, I just come up with my own projects and crowdfund them. And I'm lucky enough that like I've done previous Kickstarters that when I launch a new one, if I follow up with my previous backers, I can usually get it off the ground pretty quickly. And again, that's relative, right? Like it's not one of those crazy runaway train Kickstarters, but it's enough to make it worth my while, get books printed and just, carry on and do the next one. But it is absolutely a hustle, that's for sure.
I can imagine that could lend itself to burnout pretty easily too.
Yes, and it's something that I'm always dealing with. And again, that's just sort of part of it is just identifying that in yourself and knowing what, if anything, you can do to kind of negate it a little bit. I had mentioned that I also teach. So just as an example, my semester is almost over, so I have like a 4-month break in the summer to just dedicate myself just to those projects. So it's constantly a matter of like, I'm burnt out teaching. Now I want to get back into comics more. Just, I'm always doing them to some extent or another, even while I'm teaching. But, essentially it gets to be just my full-time job over the summer. So that's great. So what'll happen then is by the end of the summer, I'll be a little burnt out on that just in time for the next semester to start up. So I can go back and get burnt out from that again. But yeah, it is a lot of burnout, and it's a lot of just sort of, again, just making sure that there's still some satisfaction there, right? Like obviously it's a challenge and everybody has money problems and we're all trying to make a buck. But it's important for me to like remember like, hey, you finish this, you got to publish, here it is. You know what I mean? Just sort of even if it's just for 5 minutes or something, right? Like just acknowledge that you accomplished something and let it sort of, charge you up for the next one.
Right on.
So how do you take the experiences as a comic writer and, translate that into, your teaching?
Right. So I happen to teach at an art school. So a lot of the stuff that I teach is, so I teach comics classes here. I have a visual storytelling class, which is basically sequential art. One of the cool things about doing comics is it teaches a lot of different skills. So I also teach a character and creature design class because every character that shows up in my comics has to be created and designed. So it's given me a couple of different skill sets that have made sort of teaching kind of a natural thing to jump into. And I also just like it. Writing and drawing comics is awesome, but it's also very solitary. Like I sit in my dark studio in my basement and I work. So it is nice to get out and just to be a part of like a staff and other faculty. Working with students is awesome, kind of keeps me charged up. It's also cool to see the stuff that they're into. Like I'm 42, you know what I mean? Like I'm half out of touch. So it's great to see, what 19-year-olds and 21-year-olds are sort of into. Not a lot of surprises there, but it's still cool stuff to see, especially when it comes to comics, because they're coming at comics and like sort of reading them and getting them from like places that I never did. And it's just a lot of cool stuff that I definitely wouldn't have seen, left to my own devices.
So what are the kids into today? I'm 45, so
Pokemon is huge. Pokemon is universal. And, honestly, too, a lot of it is video game stuff. We have an animation and gaming art department in the college, so that's sort of a big part of the student body there. But like everybody plays video games, they play them all on all kinds of different, they have Switch and they got their PS5s. Like they're super gamers. But as far as like what are they into, definitely Pokemon. If I mention Pokemon, like everybody's eyes light up.
My sons would too.
What's that?
My sons would too.
Yeah, absolutely too. And what I had to realize too is I have an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old. And it occurred to me one day, I'm like, hey, they like the same stuff that my students like. And I'm like, oh my God, they're actually much closer in age than they are to me. So, my kids are another way that I sort of stay juiced in a little bit to like what's going on.
I think the Pokemon phenomenon is amazing because I can remember when it first broke big in the late 90s, and I was working part-time in a comic book store at the time, and all hell broke loose. Like, just these little Pokemonsters running around left, right, front, center. That's all they want to talk about. That's all they want to collect. They're not here for the comics.
Right.
All the signs of a balloon. And yet here we are over 25 years later, and we're still talking
hasn't
about
popped. Right. For me, I'm like, man, and it just as a, I don't know, an entrepreneur, whatever you want to call it, like, I'm like, man, those guys are printing money. Like, these are just cards, right? Like, it's illustration on cardboard. Like, man, just seeing like how fast my kids get into it. Now, obviously, some kids get into it and get right out of it. Like, that's very common when they're that age. But some of them get into it and stay into it. I just, $5 a pack for cards. I don't know how much that's changed over the years, but I just think about all the money they're raking in. And again, we've probably crossed like peak Pokemon, right? But like, it's still bringing in tons and tons of kids and tons of money.
Yeah.
My son's 7, and he came home and he was proud to show that he made his own Pokemon card.
Excellent. Was it a giant one?
He's trying to get it so it fits in his binder.
Gotcha. Got to have those binders, man. My kids have one. I don't remember who it was. They were watching somebody on YouTube is like a Pokemon collector, and they start talking about bad binder etiquette. I'm like, guys, what on earth is going on here? Like, you guys don't even push the chair in when you get up from the table. We're talking about Pokemon etiquette. But no, as long as they're happy, I'm happy. And, to be honest with you, just from a purely artistic standpoint, I think the Pokemon cards are awesome looking. I like the idea of like the evolution of these characters, the sort of stylization that they all go through. So anybody who comes into school who's into Pokemon, I feel like there's definitely something I can work with there.
So do you personally take any sort of inspiration from Japanese manga or anime at all?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not a super well-read guy when it comes to manga, but my favorite graphic novel series of all time is Akira. You know what I mean? So like the few that I've read have had a huge effect. It's something that I learned, and I don't know if it's just my reptile brain from reading too many American comics, but I have a real hard time reading comics or Japanese comics that aren't flipped. Like, obviously they're inverted when you get them over there. Like we read left to right, they read right to left. And sometimes we get them ported over here and translated, and they're still oriented that way. I have a hard time reading them. I don't know what it is. Like, it just stops me cold. So I think that one of the reasons why Akira was such a big hit with me, obviously I love the story and all that kind of stuff, but they had flipped it and sort of made it palatable to like Western eyes or whatever you want to call it.
Sure.
You read like traditional comics. I also like Samurai Executioner and Lone Wolf and Cub. The name of the artist and writer escaped me at the moment, but I've got a whole shelf of both of those. I love the idea of just this one artist and writer team just doing literally thousands and thousands of pages together. I think Akira is something like 5,500 pages or something when it's all done. It's outrageous. Like, as far as comic books go, like that is a page count that I can't even imagine. And I know with Akira, it was originally collected in an anthology magazine called Young Magazine in Japan. So I think they were done 8 pages at a time. So I just love the idea that, Otomo worked on this over a course of, I don't know, probably 15 years or something like that. Just, 8 pages a week at a time. And eventually it ends up with this giant kind of magnum opus. But yeah, those books are huge influences on me. And a lot of it too is just, again, I love that production quality. I love the idea of like knocking out that many pages. I think it's every cartoonist's dream to put out something that's like thousands of pages long, which is obviously much easier said than done.
Oh yeah. I mean, I shudder to even think about trying to invent 96 pages of content,
Right. Yeah. I mean, I've done 150, I've done 200-page stuff before. And again, that takes a long time, and it really does sort of wear one down. Particularly if there's 2 that I did that were graphic novels. So I find that, the story that I did for Mad Cave, they were coming out as issues. So essentially I'm turning it in every 20, 24 pages or something. When you're doing a graphic novel, like, you're literally just like, doing page after page after page. And when you're not turning them in until it's all done, you sort of worry halfway through. You're like, have I just lost my mind? Like, is this the ramblings of a madman? Like, is anything making sense to anyone? Luckily, when you're doing it issue by issue, you're checking in with editors and they will tell you if you've lost your mind. Whereas when you're working by yourself, like, there's nobody there to let you know. So I like being able to have like working issue by issue with people, if at all possible, just to have, again, that connection, just that check-in to make sure I'm on the same page. And again, like I said, I haven't gone crazy.
So we've talked about kind of your inspirations for writing. What about, your inspirations for your drawing for that part of your, process?
Yeah,
Or
that's a tricky one too, and I feel like I read and reread a lot of books that I have that like I have, like stuff that I'll buy new, and I also have a stack of like well-worn stuff that I've been reading for years that I just kind of pull out, and just look at different stuff and get inspired by it. There's a lot of sort of what's the word I'm looking for here? um, non-sexy things that I look at when I pick up an artist's work. One of the first things I look at is on a page, how many backgrounds are they drawing per page? Like how does that work? And there's a bunch of different approaches to that. You could do one big panel that has a huge background that kind of orients the reader, and then you can kind of pump the brakes on the rest of the backgrounds for the rest of the page. And I'm just curious how they're doing it and how they're pulling it off. And I feel like for me, do you guys know David Mazzucchelli, who did Batman?
Oh yeah.
He's awesome. One of my favorite cartoonists, and he's one obviously doesn't do superhero stuff or mainstream stuff anymore. But he had such a pared down style, and I think not every artist, but I think a lot of artists have this idea that we're like, is there a way for me to draw less and it'll be better? That's sort of the thing that we're always after, and I think people like David Mazzucchelli and Mike Mignola sort of make it really like a sexy thing that we could possibly attain, not knowing that that's just their style and they made that work. But Mazzucchelli's one that I look at. I'm always just looking at, is there a way to pare down, right? Or should I be adding extra detail? And again, a lot of these things are just kind of like nutty back and forth things in my head, like, oh, should I draw 3 lines for a nose fold, or should I draw 2? Like just sort of experimenting with that. And really just seeing things in print and feeling like, one of the hardest things to do, I think, is when you're working on these things for so long, is to get a fresh read on your own work. So like getting away from it for a little while and still being able to pick it up and say, okay, here's what's going right, and here's what's not. I would like to think that I have at least the ability to be honest with myself. Like if I like something or something's not working out, I can kind of tell myself that and not, break down in tears and stop working for a month. But like, okay, fine, let's scrap that panel or that page and just jump into a next one. I'm also a big fan of, I don't know if fan's the right word, but I'm also a big proponent of thumbnails for your drawings, which are essentially just, your kind of like tight sketches that you do before you
you're rough.
So, basically what I do is I work out a lot of my sort of compositional problems in that stage. And I found that as long as I like that thumbnail, that whatever's going on there is working and I like it, then I'll generally 9 times out of 10 like the page. But a lot of sort of the evolution of like my own artwork is really just kind of, simplifying and streamlining the process, because it's something, each page is like a 4-step process and you're doing 160 of those. It can get out of hand really quickly. So the idea is sort of keeping that as simple as possible without sort of the art suffering for that.
And it's going back to Little Black Book, and because it's only 4 issues, was there something that you wanted to expound on or kind of address that said had to say, well, I have a certain this certain space that I have to tell the story that needs to be told?
Well, I don't know if there's any like a storyline there, but one of the things I find that I have to be, very careful about when you're doing a 4-issue miniseries is like a character might make an offhand statement, right? And you have to be careful because as a reader, you might think, okay, that's a thing that's going to be important later, and I'm expecting it to sort of be paid off. So when you're doing a 4-issue miniseries, what I'm getting at here is I kind of end up, in theory at least, trimming off all the fat. So everything that's mentioned is germane to the story, but it's also done, I'd like to think, in a way that doesn't make it seem like that, right? Like I'm only being told things that are relevant to this small plot. But it just being sort of very aware and careful about not running out like red herrings and things like that. And if I am running out red herrings, that they're things that are going to be resolved before those 4 issues are over.
Right.
So making sure that there's none of those is probably the biggest part there. By the time we get to like when I'm writing the issues, since I started with the outline, there's generally not a case where like, oh, there was something that I wanted to get in there but didn't. Generally, everything that I wanted in there is in there. And I think that also something I've learned after doing a few 4-issue miniseries is sort of exactly how much story that is. That's always one of the biggest challenges when you're starting out, you're plotting out a story, is how much is too much? How do I unwind this story to the viewer? And just knowing that, like, essentially how much of this plot will get us through our 4 issues to the satisfactory part, essentially this ending that we have in mind. So obviously coming up with sort of how we want to end it is a very big part of the beginning process. So like once I know that, I kind of have that to work towards, and I can be careful not to sort of throw out these other sort of red herrings that might feel disappointing to a reader that picked up on them when we're expecting something from it.
Have you ever wound up in a situation where, say, you budgeted for 5 issues and then for whatever reason, circumstantially, you had to shrink it down to 4 or something like that?
Oh, definitely. And there's been times where like, earlier on, like a scene's like, hey, this scene, or even when I'm sort of writing these things, I kind of know that, okay, this in my outline, let's say issue 2 has 7 scenes in it or whatever. So, generally if that happens, at least with this process, it happens earlier than later. And just with the nature of at least the stuff that I do with like AWA, like they're very tightly regimented. And like when they say it's a 4-issue miniseries, it will be a 4-issue miniseries. Now, on the other hand, when it comes to stuff that I'm doing on my own, really the sky's the limit. And it's as much as, I can, these things can be as long or as short as I want them to. And sometimes that's dictated on like my printing budget or things like that. But I've definitely had to sort of, I would say when I'm writing and drawing my own stuff, which I mentioned was like kind of a nuttier process, things definitely happen there where like I might add a storyline and I'm like, oh, there's 8 pages I need here. Or, hey, this is 8 pages over. And the quote that I got for this print is whatever. It's 168 pages, not 172. So that kind of stuff absolutely happens all the time, sort of in my self-publishing work for sure. And, I don't mind when these little challenges pop up. I feel like, instead of looking at them as a limitation, I look at them as like, okay, it's just one of these things I have to accomplish. It's essentially a guardrail, I guess, for lack of a better word, for how I need to get to the end of this. So, and for me, that also helps when I get notes from like Axel or Mike. Like I at least I try and take them in the spirit that they were given, not get upset. Like, oh, they hate this one scene that I did. Like nothing like that. Like clearly there's a great reason for this, and listening to the note and sort of hearing the note, but also there's the note behind the note, right? Like, what, is there something else that's sort of sparking this sort of, bumping with this particular scene that I might want to go back earlier and fix a scene? So it's like, maybe that's not the scene that's the problem. It's actually 2 scenes before that set that up poorly. So just sort of being aware of things like that, and then not getting, essentially disappointed if like, what I thought was the greatest first draft in the world, comes back with a couple of notes, right? Like that's very much part and parcel of it.
Sure. You can't lead with your ego.
Absolutely not. And again, that's easier said than done. And it takes a little while, to sort of learn that, I found, but I'd like to think I'm there.
Right on. So, you also mentioned that you've done a lot of stuff with Kickstarter. Mm-hmm. What takeaways do you have from that, and what kind of wisdom can you impart on other Kickstarter adventurers?
Sure. I think the biggest one, if you're just starting out, is to, obviously we all want that runaway Kickstarter that's like, crazy 6 figures or something. And again, that's also easier said than done. My big piece of advice is sort of coming up with a concept or whatever that thing is and make it manageable for that first Kickstarter. And I think looking at it like that, which like is that, hey, this is going to be a first in a long series of Kickstarters that I'll do. And just sort of starting small, I guess, is the big one. Because one of the things I like about Kickstarter is the way it sort of compounds with interest as you do them. So I'll do, let's say I've done 2 or 3 Kickstarters, and each one of those got me, several hundred copies of whatever that project was. So every subsequent Kickstarter that I do after that, I can offer those other projects as rewards. And this is sort of how you kind of get to that, $10, $15, $20,000 rank, is having, not just the good sort of $20 widget reward, but also the $50, which is 2 or 3 books together, and the $75 reward. So all these things compound, and just knowing that you can start small, hit that goal, make it reasonable, make it something you can do, that the budget is attainable for a first-time Kickstarter, and then just sort of making sure you follow up, you finish it up, you send out your rewards, and then do another one. And I find that people are really cool. Like as soon as they get the project from whatever it is, I've mailed it to them and they've got it in their hand, that's the best time to launch your next Kickstarter. Because they look at it and they're like, hey, it came through. Why not? I like this. We'll do another one. So I think the idea is to aim small, do something attainable, knock it out of the park, and just rinse and repeat. I think that's the big part. And obviously, too, when it comes to comic Kickstarters in particular, the more art and the more time and effort you can put into the building of the page itself, to me at least, says that this is a project that the creators take seriously, right? Like they're going to put the same time and effort into the book itself. So just sort of making sure that you're sharing enough art and sort of using that. And what's cool about Kickstarter pages too, just the way they're set up, it's just perfect for you to introduce yourself, introduce the project, share some pages from it. You've got your rewards over there. And one of the things I also like about Kickstarter, after having done them for, I don't know, it's been maybe 12 years or something like that, but they're constantly changing the site, but they're changing it in like good functional ways that actually help make running Kickstarters easier, helps make backing them easier. So that's always good to see, right? Like it's very easily they could have just run that right into the ground, but they're constantly sort of innovating with it. And comics on Kickstarter are still sort of a relatively small part of the overall Kickstarter stuff, but I think it's been a consistently growing part of it. And I think that you see a lot of different creators, people who have names and followings and have been doing this for a long time, are getting in there and doing their own projects now, which I love. It's so great. Like when you get a book published, it's awesome. It's a huge accomplishment, but also it's tied up with that company. There's, how long do they have the rights to publish that? All these different elements that sort of enter into it. When you're doing a book on Kickstarter and it's all yours, all that stuff is up to you, right? Like ultimately it is a lot of pressure on your shoulders, but you can like, I've done Kickstarter projects that I own that I've published with like 3 or 4 different publishers. It's just one mini series that I did, but because I own the rights to it and it's up to me who I publish it with, I published it all over the place. It's been a lot of fun. So having that kind of control is a huge thing. And I didn't even realize this when I first started doing Kickstarters, just sort of how awesome that aspect of it is, just having the control over your books and the publishing of it, right? You know what I mean? Like 10 years later, I can publish it with whomever I want and not have to worry about going head to head with corporate lawyers or somebody, which is awesome.
Right on.
So what if any is your convention schedule for the rest of this year?
My what schedule?
Convention.
Oh, convention schedule. Thank you for asking. I'm just starting to get back into, I had done a bunch of them prior to COVID, and like I still haven't sort of gotten back on my horse to do them. So the ones that I try to do, my favorite convention is the Baltimore Comic Con. Baltimore's a great con. It's always been a great con. Like even when it's been a couple of years since I've been there, probably 4 years, I think, since I've been, but I just feel like that's a convention where, you get a great cross section of actual comic creators there. Obviously there's I'm sure you guys have been to many conventions where it's very much a pop culture thing, and that's fine. But it's always good to see one where like they're just festooned with like comic creators that like I want to go spend some money at their table.
Yeah.
So Baltimore is one I definitely want to get back into. Yeah. I did New York a bunch. Obviously that one's a little harder to get into now. But that was a big one. I just want to look around and do a bunch of different sort of smaller Pennsylvania based ones, because there's a bunch of them around me that I just always end up missing. I hear about them right when it's like, oh, it's that day. But I need to sit down and come up with the schedule. So unfortunately, the short answer is I don't have any conventions lined up at the moment, but that will change probably with the next season.
Very cool.
So look for me at East Coast comic conventions, probably in the central Northeast region.
Hey, Chad. And then
go ahead. I love Baltimore. I haven't been. I think the last time I was there was probably 2015, because then my son was born, and
that does change the game, absolutely.
And now they scheduled the convention around his birthday and my wife's. So
nice. So you're kind of locked out there, yeah.
Locked out, or you could take a family vacation.
Hey, guess what, everybody? We're going to Baltimore Comic Con. Come hang out at my table with me.
Stranger things have happened. I
think, I want to go back to them too, because I feel like now my kids are old enough, they might be impressed with some of it.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Now I can take them down there and hobnob and look important, so it could be fun.
It's like, look, kids, this is Chris Claremont. He might look like just another old white dude, but
that's
So
actually, you know what? Mention his name. There was another con that I liked, and again, I have no idea if it still goes on or not. But there was one at what's it called? It's in Ocean City, New Jersey, but it's not Ocean City. It's there's like the famous the Stone Ponies there. It's I can't remember what it's called.
Let's look.
It's on the Jersey Shore. I forget. Crap! Originally there was a big zombie walk that they did there. They had a convention there.
Asbury Park.
What's that? Asbury Park. Yes.
Yeah, it's Springsteen territory, baby.
Did they still? I don't know if Asbury still does one or not. I mean, they had moved it to a hotel down the street the last time I was there. It's been a little while, but that one was a lot of fun. And again, after doing like, I don't know if you guys have ever done like New York Comic Con.
I wish.
Logistically, it is the biggest pain in the ass I've ever had, right? Like just to get my stuff from like wherever it's at to the convention, get it set up, and get it's just logistical nightmare after logistical nightmare. Whereas stuff like the Asbury Comic Con is like as easy as pie, right? Like you show up in your car, you take everything in, you put it in the parking lot, it's time to rock and roll. Now, of course, they get a few 100,000 people in New York Comic Con, and they don't quite get that many at Asbury Park. But I love those lower key conventions where you still get a decent turnout, you still make a buck. people still come by, but it's just not a logistical pain in the ass. And also, obviously, NYC is uber expensive no matter sort of where you're staying.
So
No two ways about that.
what if you could, what would be the one thing that you could tell your younger self about where you that you know now?
Wow. Yeah, that's a tough one.
I ask some tough questions.
Man. For me, I think, and it's a silly thing. It's not really aspirational or anything, but I would tell myself to pitch more projects to more companies. I just feel like, for me at least, I was very kind of hesitant to jump into that aspect of it, and for no good reason. You know what I mean? Like, an editor will pass or accept something based on their own, proclivities, right? Like whatever they like. It's just important to kind of get into that habit. I think it's like. It's like if you're trying to find, like a girlfriend or something, you have to go out and meet people, right? Like, you're not going to accidentally get a publishing gig, just accidentally because they saw, like, a sentence you posted on Twitter or something like that. So I would tell myself to be more proactive when it comes to getting your stuff out there. I feel like, luckily for me, there was Kickstarter. So, like, instead of like just kind of floundering and saying, no, I don't want to do this anymore, I just kind of went and did it myself. But I feel like, if I could have just gotten started earlier and put, and putting my stuff out there, I don't know where. Maybe it would have led nowhere, but it's very possible it would have led more places. So I just think, getting me out of my shell earlier would have been better. So I would definitely tell young Jeff to pitch some stuff. Gosh darn it.
Even if you get stolen from, even if you don't hear back, just get out there and do it.
And true, also too, what I've learned since then is it's just about creating relationships with editors, right? Like, there's no guarantee that, like, oh, this guy likes me, he's gonna okay my pitch or not. But, like, just saying, hey, having an open door with people who sort of green light these things is the most important part. And the way that happens is just, casual acquaintance. They see your work, more than happy to look at your stuff. Whether it goes anywhere, that's up to a bunch of different stuff, right? And that's another thing that I've learned. Like, there are so many different things that go into whether or not a pitch is right for a company at a particular time.
Sure.
If they have something that's already on the shelf that's sort of tangentially similar, so the covers might be sort of in the same neighborhood. There's all kinds of different reasons why a company might pass on something, as opposed to just, we don't like you, So just knowing that those things happen, and a yes or a no now might be a yes next year. So just, don't be dejected by it.
It's funny you say all that. We were talking to Mike Martz at Mad Cave just 2 days ago, and he said literally the same thing. So
yes,
yeah, there must be some pearls of wisdom there.
Absolutely. And Mad Cave's a good one because they're one that I've actually been pitching recently, and there was a few that didn't quite make it, and again, because perfectly logical reasons of, like, books that they had on the shelves that were already sort of similar, or books that were already, like, well into production that nobody's seen yet. That are a little too similar. So, and again, there's always things that kind of go into it. And like I said, the big thing is just not to be dejected by it. Don't
yeah. So, well, Jeff, we are up against the end of our hour. Thank you very much for hanging out with us.
Hey, thanks a lot, guys. These are great questions. A lot of fun.
Yeah. Well, we do our best. We have been doing this for a while now. I think Chad and I have our.
Well, I saw that. Is this show number? What is this? 213? Is that 213?
Yeah, we've been chugging along. Let's see. I've been on it. Neither one of us were first members of the show. In fact, I came on in episode 17, and Chad, you were what? Somewhere in the 90s.
170 something, I believe.
No, it had to have been sooner than that. Are you sure? Okay, well, yeah, but we're still here. We're still doing our thing, so we must be doing something right.
Absolutely.
They haven't fired us yet. One last question from Juan Motoa. Again, wants to know what the chances are of a trade paperback for Little Black Book.
It's definitely going to happen. So AWA does, like, they'll put out the issue 1 through 4, and then they put out a trade. And one of the things I love about AWA and the trades that they put out is, I believe, they're all sort of in the $10 to $12 range, which for me is my sweet spot. Like, I'll pick almost any graphic novel up if it's $10 to $12, right? Like, that's a perfect spot.
That's a steal.
And one of the sneaky things that we do with the AWA books is they're technically 24 pages per issue. Mm-hmm. So a lot of comics are 20 pages now. So technically it ends up being about 25, or it ends up being about 5 issues, even though it's sold and retailed as 4 issues. So it's about 100 pages of content, which I think makes a nice little trade paperback. So that should be out. They're usually done pretty quickly after the books come out. So I would say probably before the beginning of probably in the fall, they'll probably have that one out. But yes, no, that will absolutely be out because I know the first, or I'm sorry, the fourth man came out I think 3 months after the final issue came out, so pretty soon.
Awesome. Well, there you have it. Well, Jeff McComsey, thank you very much for being on the show. Thank you for doing what you do as a writer and an artist and creator and teacher and purveyor of fine comics everywhere. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Chad for continuously putting up with me week in, week out. He shrugs it off, but he knows what I'm talking about. Listen out there. The world can be a crap place, but it doesn't have to be.
Hold on.
We've got Chad who's saying, Matt, stop your spiel.
Follow us on Twitter. We're only 11 away from 4,000. Please.
I'm on it. I will personally do my part.
Comic-watch.com. We're on Twitter. We're on Facebook. We're occasionally even on Instagram.
And TikTok.
And TikTok when we remember. But yeah, that's our show for the week. We'll be back next week with Chris Eliopoulos, the one, the only, the man, the myth, the legend. So until then,
company. That's awesome.
Yeah, well, we think so. Until then, be kind to each other and support your local comic stores. Thank you very much. We are the Comic Watchers, and this is our show.